What's up, New Zealand and the world? Lucas Lawman's a Kiwi Voice. We are sitting here with Mr. Tom O'Connor, a historian, journalist, over a long period of time, worked for a few different publications. So we're going to do the usual Kiwi Voice thing and have a bit of a conversation about various matters. So let's get into it. Thanks, Tom, for joining us. I really appreciate you inviting me into your home and for a conversation.
Well, it gives me a day off the farm, so that's fine.
Excellent. Good to hear. Alrighty, so I'd really love to learn a bit about yourself, at least to kick off with. A bit of a history of where you've come from and to, in terms of your journalism and all those bits and pieces through the years. Let you go off and tell us a little bit about Tom O'Connor.
Yeah, well, I started journalism in 1963, which is quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I did a whole lot of things as well, and worked for a government department as a media guru, for a whatever better term.
Yeah.
But I had an advantage, and I was reasonably bilingual. I grew up in a tiny little North Island community where most people were bilingual to some degree. I'm not natively fluent, but I have a good understanding of written and spoken Maori.
Right.
And I specialised in Maori history for, I don't know, about 30 years.
So quite early on. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I came back to journalism full-time in 1982, and based in the King Country, where there was a lot of Maori news going on and nobody was really covering it, so I worked for a newspaper there. Then I moved down to Marlborough in 1987 at about time of the Naito hearings.
Okay.
So I was employed by a newspaper there as a Maori Affairs journalist, and I think I was one of the few Pākehā Maori Affairs journalists in the country at the time.
Yeah.
That's changed now, and changed for the better.
Yes.
Journalists now started to use both languages more and more. Some of them have got a long way to go, and some of them are doing really well.
Yeah.
It's actually very difficult to learn a second language as an adult. So some of the TV journalists are actually doing quite well.
Right. Yeah, and that's a key point that gets brought up a bit in conversation. So you'd be of the opinion then, I am assuming, that within the current mainstream media environment, there are a lot of really good journalists, but it's perhaps the distrust and things that are cropping up these days in society is more around the organisation as a whole and not necessarily those individuals.
No, not at all. They're doing a sound professional job.
Yeah.
And some of the resentment to the use of Maori language in radio and TV is only a reaction. It's a symptom of something that's much, much deeper.
Got you.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And so, let's lead into that, because you've got a history, obviously, long history in journalism and, the whole body of everything to do with it. So what are your thoughts on the state of journalism in New Zealand at the moment?
I think they're in a very sad situation in that print media are in financial trouble simply because of the march of modern technology and social media and all the rest of it. Professional journalists work to very strict rules, and they have to.
Yeah.
But if the industry can't support them, then they're in trouble. So we've ended up with government assistance, which I absolutely applaud. They should have done that. But attached to that government assistance, there's an intrusion into professionalism.
Got you. Okay.
And that the government established a $55 million contestable fund for public interest journalism, I think they call it.
Yes, correct, yeah.
But to qualify for a grant from that, you have to compromise your objectivity in terms of reporting things Maori. And that is most unfortunate because the government should not do that.
Yeah.
That's for professional journalists to do that, and they don't need to be told how to be objective.
Okay. So your issue is more with not so much the funding itself, but the caveats that are attached to it.
Yeah. Exactly, the qualifications for it, and they should not have done that. Professional journalists, as opposed to keyboard warriors on social media, work to very strict standards, and it's very, very hard to love journalists because people react to the news, whether it's good, bad, and or indifferent.
Yeah.
And so it becomes open season on the messenger.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We have seen a lot of that out and about, and different covering different protests and other public events, etc. And you do have this overarching or sort of wide-ranging distrust of whoever the person is that's there, from Stuff or News Hub or TVNZ or whatever. So,
yeah, but that's a distrust of the establishment in general.
Yes.
And so it washes over on, and journalists get accustomed to that. We were used to that, and yeah, there's a few stupid things that have always been said, but journalists put themselves at a risk in doing their job, particularly covering potentially violent issues and events. And we had a terrible thing in Ukraine, or not in Ukraine, but in Israel just recently,
right,
where a young journalist was deliberately shot.
Yes.
And she wasn't the victim of accidental crossfire. She was murdered by a sniper,
Yeah, gotcha.
and simply because she was a journalist doing her job.
Yes.
You know, and that's a reprehensible act.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course it is. Yeah, there's been those certain occasions at different times over the last few years where that's cropped up, and it is always sad because it's always been seen, at least from my, looking into the industry and my love of the industry, that they should be protected. They're bringing the news to the people.
Well, yeah, most civilised societies do. I've known two journalists who lost their lives overseas, just getting too close to the action, but they weren't targeted. They were hit by bombs, and the bombs weren't intended for them. They were just up the front line with the soldiers. And that's accidental crossfire, and that's the risk journalists willingly and knowingly take.
Gotcha.
But that young woman wasn't there.
Yes.
She was targeted by a sniper. That's
Right.
murder. And
Yeah.
that's a reprehensible thing to do.
Absolutely, it's really sad. So I just want to touch on there. You were saying, the public distrust and some of the backlash and some of the things that are going on online in terms of directed towards journalists. Did I pick up that you were saying there was some form of that, back in the day when you were doing your thing, or just in a different form, perhaps?
There always was. Depends where you went and how you presented yourself.
Yep.
But you soon learned to be diplomatic, and you soon learned how to deal with those situations. And we weren't taught that at varsity or at Polytech. You learnt that on the job.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, so
it's probably not something that could be taught, perhaps, resilience and diplomacy. Yeah.
Some of the things I've had to do would not be taught anywhere.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, to get by.
Yeah.
So going into a little bit more detail for the viewers. So you wrote for Waikato Times, was it you were saying earlier? Or?
After I retired from frontline journalism, then I became a columnist for Stuff through Waikato Times, and I did that for about 12 or 13 years.
Okay. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so in terms of what's happening with journalism in New Zealand at the moment, and you said that the distrust, or you feel there's a distrust out there of the establishment in general, how, for journalism as a profession, has it always had this link, or perceived link, to the establishment, to government, or do you think that's more of a recent thing?
No, it's very recent. In my experience, it's very recent. Journalism always stood aloof from government, and were always able to ask the hard questions, particularly of politicians, and it was never personal. And I've had to do some what we call interrogatory interviews with politicians in times gone by. But they understood, and I understood, that I wasn't asking those questions for me personally.
Yes.
I was asking the questions on behalf of people who would read what I wrote.
Yes. Yeah.
So we had to play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
And that's the job. And experienced politicians and experienced journalists understand that.
Yeah, for sure. So looking at that, where do you think some of that distrust comes from?
The distrust that I've seen in the community at large and in journalism has come from the actions of the current government over the last 18 months.
Right.
And that was the introduction of the idea of co-governance and the impact that has, or the perceived impact that can have on democracy.
Yeah, okay.
But nobody really knows what the government's intentions are with co-governance, but co-governance can mean almost anything anybody wants it to mean.
Sure, yes, so perhaps for the viewers, we do get a lot of comments asking about this particular subject. So perhaps if you could, for us, Tom, just give us a brief background as to what co-governance is.
Well, co-governance really is an indication that there are at least, there's two groups of people involved in the governance or the management of an entity.
Okay.
That's co-governance.
Yep.
And it's been around for actually quite a long time. There are examples of co-governance in New Zealand, and they don't really work.
Right.
But what's happened just recently
Yes.
is that there's a push to have co-governance in local government on district councils and regional councils. And my understanding is that the intention is some form of recompense for Maori for what happened in the colonial era to ensure that they have a place on local government.
Gotcha.
It's absolutely unnecessary to do that. There's never been any impediment for anybody to stand for local government
Yes.
or parliament.
Yes.
In fact, the Maori seats in parliament predated votes for women.
Gotcha.
The Maori seats in parliament since 1867.
Right, okay. Yep.
So,
Yep.
but co-governance cuts across the basic principles of democracy. And there's been moved by two local authorities to have guaranteed seats for Maori on their councils. Now, it's quite different to having a Maori ward. I don't have an issue with Maori wards.
Sure.
Provided that the ratepayers of a district or a region agree to have a Maori ward, then you have a Maori ward, and those candidates are elected on the Maori electoral roll. No problem with that at all. In Rotorua,
I was going to ask you whether you were going to get to Rotorua.
well, in Rotorua, they wanted to have 3 seats for Maori, 3 seats for Pākehā or non-Maori, and another 4 general seats for anybody who wanted to stand.
Okay. That's interesting.
That raised some issues for me in that the district council did not seek a mandate from their ratepayers to do that. And it was so outside the normal parameters of Western style democracy that they needed a special act of parliament.
Yes.
It went past first reading, and it can do that because Labour has a majority in the House. But David Parker, the Attorney General, a very astute guy, he had a look at it and advised government that it was contrary to the provisions of the New Zealand Bill of Rights.
Okay, yeah.
In that, because of the population differences, it gave the Maori vote much more weight than the non-Maori vote.
And this is the Tamati Coffee's bill, wasn't it, that he was pushing? Is that the Labour MP?
I don't know who was steering it through the House.
Right. I think it might have been.
Yeah, but it went before the Maori Affairs Select Committee. It should not have.
Yeah.
It should have gone to the Local Government Select Committee.
Gotcha.
But Tamati Coffee is the chair of the Maori Affairs Select Committee.
Gotcha.
So he's certainly involved with it.
Yeah.
So where that bill has got to, I don't know. It's certainly stalled, but what's happened with it since, I don't know.
Yeah, I've got a feeling that like you say, it could be that it's just stalled. I know that it has at least stopped in some way. There was a website, protectyourvote.nz, I think it was, and it was specifically advocating to stop this from happening.
But I don't believe that move was deliberately dishonest or sinister.
Okay.
They were trying to achieve something that I don't think anybody would object to. It was the methodology that was wrong.
Right, okay.
And there was another example down in Christchurch where the Canterbury Regional Council promoted a bill, and that's gone past first reading as well, that will allow Ngāi Tahu to appoint 2 members to the council. So they'll be fully salaried, fully voting members of the Canterbury Regional Council. No vote on the general role or the Maori role.
Right.
And it wasn't just Maori, it was specifically Ngāi
Yeah, gotcha.
So Ngāi wanted to do that so that no other Maori could come in and be one of their councils in their tribal area.
Yeah, right.
To me, that is
It's pushing tribalism a little more.
well, it's tribalism, but it's as undemocratic as the Rotorua Bill. I've formally written to David Parker asking him to explain the difference between the two and asking his opinion on what should happen to that bill. So those are distortions of democracy, and even if the intent is honourable, the methodology is absolutely wrong.
Right.
And that creates distrust, and from distrust comes resentment. But if people don't know what co-governance really means in terms of the government's philosophy, then they will look for targets.
Yes.
But if they haven't got a clear target for their annoyance and their frustration, they'll find one.
And do you think that's due to lack of information?
Absolute lack of information. So in an absence, in a vacuum of reliable information, misinformation and myths and legends grow like mushrooms in a dark place. So that's where we've got a lot of loud noise coming from ill-informed people, and some of that loud noise is racist. And it was absolutely predictable this would happen. If you divide society like this, you're going to get a reaction. And there's a move towards creating a separate class of New Zealand citizenship, a privileged class of New Zealand citizenship for Maori. And once again, the intention is probably commendable, and it's a way of some form of recompense for what happened in the past. But you can't do that and claim it's democracy because it isn't. It clearly isn't. And if you do have two classes of citizenship, it's absolutely unavoidable that you're going to have a contest for supremacy between them. So that will divide the country more so than it's divided now. And even if you put aside the redneck racists, and we've got far too many of them anyway.
I think most countries do.
And everybody's got them. Even people who are pro-Maori, and I am, that's a very uncomfortable thing to do, because you drive a wedge through the middle of the community.
Do you think that's also what's going on with Three Waters in terms of the model, the government's
Absolutely
model?
What's going on with Three Waters, and they still haven't made a good business case for what they're trying to do there. It was a shotgun approach to a localised issue. But to have the management entities controlled or governed by 50% Maori is separatism. And if you do that, you're going to get a huge negative reaction, and most of that huge negative reaction is ill-informed, because government is not informing us. And some of that ill-informed negative reaction will be racist. And that is absolutely unfortunate, and it's absolutely unavoidable, and didn't need to happen.
So you're saying because of the way that the information is being fed and etc., then people just go off on what little they have and form these different opinions.
Yes, they will. I mean, if the government wanted to reform the Three Waters management system, and goodness knows there's need for change and need for improvement, some local authorities needed a huge amount of help to get their systems operating correctly and properly. A few local authorities need a little bit of help. Most of them need no help at all. They need to be just left alone. But to take a blanket approach and then to blatantly claim that it will be 50% controlled by Maori perpetuates the myth of a dual partnership, of a dual citizenship. And we haven't got a dual citizenship. And we can't have a dual citizenship because that will just divide the nation.
Oh, just
and if that's deliberate, then you have to ask why they're doing that. And there's all sorts of theories about that.
Oh, of course, yeah, you can go way deep on the idea of government driving division for control or whatever.
Yes.
You go down those different paths. So
I can't say that they're doing that deliberately, but it's certainly happening, and I predicted this way back in 1999.
Yeah,
I could see it coming.
Okay.
And it grieves me that it's here, and nobody knows how to deal with it. Everybody is stepping around. It's a very uncomfortable subject because the race card is a very easy card to play.
Yes, yeah.
Lots of people have called me racist because of my comments. Nobody's ever done it twice.
I like it. Yeah.
But it's understandable. But when people fall back onto calling people names and racists, it tells me that they haven't got another argument.
Yes, yeah.
They've got no other argument.
Yeah, the default is either you're a right winger, you're racist, or you're homophobic. It just comes out boom straight away.
That's right.
Because there is no actual factual backing to it.
Well, humans like to put other humans in pigeonholes, and that's just how it happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
But our democracy is a very delicate system, and it can be distorted more easily here than anywhere else because we haven't got a constitution as such. Our constitutional laws is spread through a number of statutes, but we haven't got a constitution like the United States. So and so our government is absolutely sovereign. Our government can do exactly what it likes, particularly when they have a majority in the House.
Yes.
So they can do what they like.
Yeah.
So, but democracy has evolved to its present form over about 3,500 years for no other reason than those systems actually work.
Yes.
It's cumbersome, it's frustrating, but there's nothing better as far as freedom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Freedom-loving people are concerned.
Yes.
But democracy allows the existence of elements within itself that would seek its own destruction.
Okay.
And what I mean by that, in a democratic society, I can advocate for our democratic system to be replaced by dictatorship.
Yeah.
And democracy protects my right to do that.
Yeah, right.
And it's the only political system in the world that allows that to happen.
Yeah.
So it's very, very delicate. It's very vulnerable to distortion. And that's what we have now. I still don't believe those actions are sinister or dishonest,
Okay. Yep.
but I think they are seriously misguided and seriously misled.
Right.
And some of that misguidance comes from the fact that we now have about 20% of our parliament are Maori, and the Labour Party has an informal Maori caucus, enormously powerful group of people, but their loyalty is not entirely to New Zealand as a single unified nation. Their loyalty is to Maori.
Okay.
And that's what happens.
Yes.
But without them, the Labour government would fail.
Right. Right.
And the Prime Minister and her inner circle know that.
And when you say they would fail, is that around competency and skills and knowledge, or is that around?
No. The Maori caucus could up anchors and leave the Labour Party tomorrow, and we haven't got a government anymore.
Yeah, gotcha.
So they are enormously powerful.
Yes.
And once again, that's the vulnerability of democracy.
Yes.
And you can't blame Maori members of Parliament for doing that.
Yeah.
You know, they're in there looking after their people.
Yeah.
But who are their people?
Yeah.
Their people should be Maori Pākehā together.
Yes. Yeah.
But that may be so for some of them, but not all of them.
Yeah, gotcha. So you mentioned there that you saw this coming in '99-ish. So what was driving your thought pattern then? Yeah.
I was working for a government department, and there was an intrusion into almost anything and everything we did.
Right.
A degree of psychopathic tokenism in that every meeting was started with a karakia, and people would stand up and read something off a piece of cardboard or a piece of paper, had absolutely no idea what the words meant.
Right. Yeah.
And we weren't in a church, we were in a government department running a meeting. And the karakia that I use today are not the Karakia of old.
Right.
They are badly translated Wesleyan Christian prayers into Maori, and with limited understanding of what the words meant. I've no objection to it personally because I have an understanding of the language. Most people didn't.
Well, so you just to clarify for the viewers, so you speak Te Reo Māori fluently, or?
I wouldn't say fluently. A fluent Maori speaker will tell you that I don't.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And somebody who has no understanding of the language assumes that I do.
Yeah, right.
But I do not. I am not natively fluent.
Yeah, okay.
But I went to school speaking two languages, albeit to a 5-year-old's level of fluency. So there are serious flaws in my spoken Maori, and there are serious flaws in my spoken English because of my spoken Maori.
Gotcha. Yeah.
In between those two, there's another language made famous by Billy T. Jones.
Okay. Yeah.
And some people find it humorous, other people find it offensive.
Yeah.
But when we go home, that's how we speak. And when I come back down here, it takes me about a week to get out of it.
Yeah, right.
It is a true language. It's almost a Creole.
Yeah.
And if you learn it as a kid, you can speak it. And if you didn't learn it as a kid, you can't.
Yeah.
And many people try to imitate it, and they can't do it.
Right.
So it's a language in its own right.
Yeah. Yeah.
When I first came here, I had 2 old soldiers who were Maori, and I used to go and have lunch with them 2 or 3 times a month at the RSA, and it was the only time I had the opportunity to converse in Te Reo Māori.
Gotcha.
But sadly, both of them are gone, and I have no one to speak to.
Right.
And the Naitahu dialect is marginally different to the language that I learned. I learned in the Waikato, so I learned the Tainui dialect.
Gotcha.
It's not hugely different, but yeah, and I can speak both, but most certainly not natively.
It's interesting that there. So, look, as a 41-year-old Kiwi, spent my whole life here, I didn't realise there were different dialects.
There's about 7.
Yeah, wow. Okay, yeah, that is.
So if somebody is from way up in the far north, Napu,
Yeah.
I can tell you that Napu just by the way they speak.
Gotcha.
People from Taranaki, particularly Te Atiawa, and those people, they speak their own dialect as well, and it's understandable. People from Tuhoi, like Tuhoi, they speak their own dialect with different words, and so do Ngāti Pro.
Yeah, wow.
And there's probably more than I don't know about.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Wow, awesome. Well, we were touching on the Three Water side of things as we went through the co-governance discussion. Just want to sort of touch back on that. What's your understanding of where things are at with that now? And how
I don't know any more than anybody else with that. There is most certainly an intention by government to give Maori privileged access to local government bodies by way of special seats or whatever. It already exists with Maori wards if local authorities want them. But local authorities shouldn't make that decision on their own, and that decision should not be imposed on them. When district councils in the North Island have gone out to their ratepayers and asked if they wanted a Maori ward, a number of them have said yes. Okay. So the established a Maori, I have absolutely no issue with that at all, because it's what the ratepayers wanted.
Yes.
It's the people speaking.
Yeah.
It's where that is imposed that you're going to create serious division. But co-governance has failed in a number of other areas. I'll give you 2 examples. The first one that I was aware of is a little island called Takaporiawa in Cook Strait, just to the north of Devil Island. In 1886, it was owned by 2 groups of people, Ngāti Kuata and Ngāti Kuia. Excuse me. And the government of the day wanted the island for a lighthouse. Cook Strait, very dangerous place for sailing ships. So they forced the people to put the names of their rangatira and their kaumātua on a title. So they created a crown title for the land, for the island. Then they took it under the Government Works Act, built a lighthouse on it, and a house for a lighthouse keeper. Okay. The lighthouse keeper had domestic animals and cats and destroyed a lot of the native wildlife. Whether he had a house cow up there or not, I don't know. It's not a big island. In 100 years later, in 1996, 1986, the government automated all the lighthouses.
Right.
So we didn't need lighthouse keepers, so they disappeared. And so Ngāti Koata quite reasonably went to government and said, well, we'd like our island back, please. Now, under the Public Works Act, if you take a piece of land under the Public Works Act for a government purpose, which you're allowed to do, and that purpose no longer exists, that land is supposed to, under law, go back to the original owners or back to the descendants of the owners.
Okay.
It goes back.
Yep.
But they didn't get it back after a long, long time of debate and discussion and argument. They ended up with a joint management structure between Ngāti Koata and the Department of Conservation,
Right.
co-governance.
Okay, yeah.
They didn't get their island back, and they should have got their island back.
Yeah.
Now, I was furious. I was a journalist there at the time, and I was furious because those people were absolutely legally entitled to have that island back unencumbered.
Yeah.
The other bigger example was the people of Tuhoi. Now, they had a huge lot of territory taken off them after the land wars, which ground to a terrible halt about 1872. And Tuhoi were accused of harbouring a fugitive from the British, a guy called Te Kooti. Whether they did or they didn't is an irrelevancy.
Yeah.
But they had a huge lump of territory taken off them. And they were dispossessed, and that big lump of territory then became a national park.
Right.
And the Waitangi Tribunal eventually found and determined that Tuhoi had a case for the return of Te Uruwera.
Gotcha.
And they didn't get it after a long, long and painful, expensive debate that ended up with exactly the same system, with a joint management system between them and the Department of Conservation.
Right.
Absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
Tuhoi should have been given Te Uruwera back, unencumbered, in the same legal status as it was when it was taken from them.
And were they arguing that particular point?
Look, I don't know, and I can't speak for Tuhoi, but they did go to government and said, we want our land back.
Yeah.
And they were absolutely entitled to that. But they didn't get it.
Yeah, okay.
So that's where co-governance, two examples, and there are others, where co-governance has failed the people.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, from that particular side, it's interesting to hear. When you go into a bit deeper and you learn these bits of history and how it all came about and how it relates to today. It's really cool to get that sort of knowledge, Tom. I appreciate it. So, in terms of what's happening in New Zealand at the moment, around all this co-governance stuff, but also obviously around these concerns from both co-governance and elsewhere, some people say attacks on democracy, etc., or definitely affecting democracy, as you say, it's a fragile thing. How do you see things playing out between now and the next election? Do you think there's going to be significant changes? How do you think that's all going to go?
I haven't got a crystal ball. I don't know, but I am not optimistic of a good outcome unless the government changes what it's doing, because the resentment is seething.
Yes.
And we're always going to have angry people in society, and I've met and interviewed lots of angry people.
Yeah.
But when you've got law-abiding, gentle people becoming dangerously angry, something's wrong.
Yeah.
And this government needs to listen and take note and be very, very careful of what they're doing, because they've started down a track of the duality of citizenship, and it's a long way back.
Yeah.
It's a long way back. So I'm not optimistic at all.
Okay, yeah.
I'm really not. And I'm not a pessimist by heart at all.
Yeah.
But it's New Zealanders, by and large, are gentle, non-aggressive, non-violent people. We don't do stupid stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't see this becoming violent or dangerous. But I do see the resentment being imposed or directed not so much towards government, but towards Māori.
Yeah, okay.
And Māori at large are not asking for this.
No. No.
As far as I know, and I don't speak for Maori.
Yes, yes.
But they become the scapegoats. They become the easy target for racists and other stupid people. And that is most unfortunate, because that should not happen.
Yeah, absolutely. We've out and about in the community, and the coverage that I've been doing of some of the protests and that sort of stuff, I always look back across my childhood growing up, so I'm in my early 40s now, and always saw New Zealand as this calm, peaceful, soft almost country in terms of society. We've been at the bottom of the world, away from everyone. It's very chilled out here. I just didn't know that there was the potential for this kind of unrest. Is probably not the right word. It's a bit strong, but this feeling of discomfort, this feeling of tension. That's in society. There's been nothing like it in the last from my experience personally, in the last couple of years. So, I sort of pick up for what you're saying there, Tom. That you're feeling some of that too. You've seen some of that too.
I see it more down here than up home in the North Island. But we've been divided before. Yeah. We were divided over the rugby tour of '81. Yep. We were divided over nuclear weapons. We were divided over hydroelectric power stations.
Yes.
But people couldn't get involved in those protests and disputes, or they could stand aloof from them if they wanted to.
Yes.
This division will affect everybody.
Yeah, it's right in there.
And you can't stand aloof from this one. This is going to cover everybody.
Yeah.
So that disquiet very quickly turns to anger. But they haven't got a clear target to direct the anger at, so they will direct it at Maori.
That's an interesting viewpoint. With the Three Waters side of things, and what we've been discussing around the co-governance governance aspect of that, the fact that it seems to be, from what I've picked up across the country, I think it was 64 out of 67 councils or something opposed it. Why do you think the government's so intent on continuing to push it through? Do you think that they really think this is the best idea, or is there other motives at play? That's a big one.
Yeah, I don't know whether it is certainty, but without the Māori Labour Caucus, I don't think the government would be pushing it at all.
Yeah, okay.
I think that's where the impetus has come from.
Right.
And if they took out the 50% Māori governance control, I think the opposition to it probably wouldn't be so vociferous and so angry.
Gotcha.
But there would still be opposition to it.
Yes.
It's an added element that they didn't need to do.
Yeah.
There's no need to do that.
Yeah.
It creates the impression that Maori have some form of affinity with or ownership of water that non-Maori don't have. That's a myth. They don't.
Okay. Yep, so...
But once again, it's a duality of citizenship thing.
Yes. So do you see there is Three Waters as a policy, as an ideal? You see that there is need to do something?
There was certainly need to help those local authorities that had inadequate systems and inadequate investment.
Yeah.
And there's lots of them where the investment has been kept to a bare minimum to keep rates down, etc., etc. Right. So their reticulation systems got outdated and needing massive investment for replacement. Those local authorities needed a lot of assistance. Others needed a little bit of assistance to get up to scratch. Most of the rest need no assistance at all. Gotcha. But most of the smaller groups, in fact, the district council doesn't own those systems, they're owned privately.
Right.
And the district council manages them and oversees them to make sure they're maintained properly. Yeah. But the ownership actually rests with groups of ratepayers.
Sure.
So it's not a simple issue. Yeah. And a blanket approach, in this occasion anyway, is extremely unwise in my view.
Yeah, so they're not a fan of, or not. Don't think it's the right idea to go into the four large entities and.
Well,
should be each council individually. Is that what I'm picking up?
Yeah, the four entities could become, once they take over the Three Waters, some district councils would have almost no other reason to exist. Yeah. You take away about a third of their business operation, if you take away that, you take away the staff that goes with it.
Yes.
The district council disappears.
Yeah.
In the fullness of time, and it might be quite a short time, those 4 entities could take over all the functions of local government. So we get rid of all the district councils and all the regional councils and have 4 unitary authorities. Co-governed 50% by Māori.
Yes.
Where do you think that'll go?
Yeah. Yeah. Well.
That would be a very uncomfortable thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. So thanks for talking to us today, Tom. Really appreciate it. It's been a learning experience for me. Would love to get you back on, or I'd love to come on back down and have a bit of a yarn about other things Māori, New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi, etc. If you're keen for that.
Yeah, I don't speak for Māori,
Yeah.
and I don't particularly speak for Pākehā either.
Yeah. Right.
But I speak from my own personal experience.
Yeah, 100%, and we would love to hear that. So we'll close it off there, team. Really appreciate everyone tuning in. As per usual, if you've got any questions or anything, comments, chuck them down below. I'll get amongst the conversation. Like, share this all around, usual stuff. Really appreciate it. And we'll get Tom back on and have a bit of yarn about other things, Māori, New Zealand, national identity, Treaty of Waitangi, that sort of stuff from his experience. So catch us all soon. Stay safe, stay free. Alrighty, I'll do my intro.